Um, so I wanted to make a video about the anecdotes that I would have told that have to do with week two's topics. So for the first one, I wanted to describe why I included a video on the biosphere includes humans. I think it's because in industrial civilization, many people feel like they're separate from the ecosystems they inhabit. And in fact, we take a lot of steps to insulate ourselves from the sources of our own sustenance. Many of you probably have not made anything that you have eaten. You haven't grown anything you've eaten, at least in a little while. Some of you may, and that's great. But I think we don't feel like we are part of the world that we inhabit as much as we are, because if there were interruptions of the food supply, we would have some major concerns in just a couple of days. And so feeling that, developing the realization that people are part of ecosystems, not separate from it, I feel like is really important. And that's part of why I have the field trips to various parts of the world, because I think that helps make that point that here we are in Bomber Canyon, or here we are wherever we are in the world. And there are really interesting things. So on the topic of biodiversity, I also want to talk about how the world is full of these really incredible things that we're surrounded by. And I'd encourage you to try to look for them in the world. So when I was a kid growing up on the East Coast, we had fireflies that were in our backyard in the evenings that light up, and it was really neat. And then we lived in New Zealand for a year. My wife and kids and I lived in New Zealand for a year. And we had endangered cockabirds, parrots, that used to come and sit on our porch. And they were a little clumsy. And this one cockabird used to hang out on a tree. And one time it was just standing there and it just fell over. It was hanging from its branch. And there was a tui bird nearby that was a much fancier bird, and it didn't seem very impressed by this inelegant parrot. But so now, now with Bomber Canyon, it's full of rattlesnakes and quail and tarantulas and other neat things. And the fact that there are coyotes that roam around the neighborhood where I live, I find it really neat that there are these predators, these wild predators. And even though they once tried to eat my dog, which was pretty scary, I still feel like it makes the world feel more magical to have these other creatures in it, not just humans and our well-manicured ecosystems. So also with regard to ecosystem services, I included a video about ecosystem services. Ultimately, though, I'm pretty ambivalent about the term ecosystem services. On the one hand, yes, humans rely on ecosystems. On the other hand, I feel like it takes away from the inherent value of the world that we live in by talking about it as a service. So I feel like a ground squirrel or a quail isn't a service. An economist maybe could say that I get some marginal utility from it. But in my heart, I feel like squirrel and quails and all the other creatures that we share this planet with have a right to exist for themselves and not just for me. You don't have to necessarily share that opinion, but I feel like that underlies my ambivalence about the term ecosystem services. So I also wanted to tell a quick story about climate change and why it's a sort of a tricky concept to have a direct feeling about. Ultimately, the world changes more within a given year than it changes across years. So it goes from cold in the winter to warm in the summer, and the variability across years is greater than, or the variability within years is greater than the variability across years. And so because it changes from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit around here, or sometimes even 40s and 50s, talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is I think about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, doesn't seem like that big a deal when the weather changes so much more dramatically. But that's one of the reasons why it's good that we have science, because science allows us to understand how these changes are happening, understand that the hot temperatures are getting hotter and the cold temperatures are also getting hotter, and that we are getting more storms and many other changes. And so climate change is happening, even though it's very easy to look at it and be like, well, I don't know, it's cold today. But That's one of the good things about science. It lets us understand what is really happening in our world. So with regard to fossil fuel chemistry, this is one of my favorite bits of science. It's a pretty simple piece of chemistry, the notion of octane combustion. But I feel like it underlies the entire climate change dilemma. The realization that what we want is the energy that we get from burning fossil fuels, and the side effect of extracting that energy is the production of CO2, which is an invisible gas, and therefore there's no real reason we would notice it particularly. But its accumulation in the atmosphere is what is causing climate change. And so I feel like that piece of chemistry, even though chemistry certainly wasn't my favorite subject as an undergrad, it is still a really important piece, I think, of understanding how this whole system fits together. So with regard to sea level rise, there's a term called albedo, A-L-B-E-D-O, that is the reflectivity of a given surface. And so ice is white, and it has a high albedo, so it reflects a lot of light back into the atmosphere in a way that the ocean is typically sort of a dark blue or dark green and has a much lower albedo in that it does not reflect as much energy back. Because it doesn't reflect the energy back, it absorbs that energy. And so this is one of the challenges with sea level rise, is that as glaciers melt, there is less of the surface of the Earth that has a high albedo, and therefore it goes from reflecting a lot of the energy back to reflecting less of the energy back. And that is an instance of a feedback loop where the melting of the glaciers causes a reduction in the average albedo of the planet. And that then means that the Earth absorbs more and more of the energy from the sun. Let's see, I also had a story about biodiversity loss. So as I get older, I notice more and more that there aren't as many insects as there were when I was a kid. And sadly, the way I know this is based on how many dead bugs there are in the front of my car when I go for particular drives. And in fact, I saw an interesting thing. There was a set of sparrows at a rest stop in Central California that has adapted to realize that they can eat the dead bugs off the front of cars. And so they live at this rest stop, and when a car stops to use the bathroom or buy a soda or something like that, they hop off and go eat all the dead bugs that are on the front of the cars. And it's really neat to see processes like that unfolding, but it also makes me sad that that species are going extinct so rapidly. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was tipping points. And these are issues that I feel like are one of the reasons why it is hard to come back from climate change. That as we enact more and more global change, it is harder and harder to sort of back out of that. Because, for example, let's say, so with my kid the other day, I was using a magnifying glass to burn leaves out on the front porch because it's it's a thing I did as a kid and a thing my kid and I are doing now. So if you take a magnifying glass and you aim it at a leaf, it warms up first. And if you take the magnifying glass away, it will cool down and no major change has transpired in the leaf. But if you use the magnifying glass and heat it up enough, it will burst into flames. And then if you leave it alone, it will turn into ash. It does not turn back into a cool leaf. So the world is full of tipping points like this. And that's one of the real challenges, is that we are living in a world where tipping points exist. And if we push the planet past certain tipping points, we may not be able to go back. And we, like many other species, rely on the Earth having relatively consistent temperatures and relatively consistent weather patterns. And if we pass some of these tipping points, it may no longer be able to support the kind of lifestyle that we expect it to. And so that's why I feel like it's important to think about tipping points in the context of all of these issues. Okay, so those are my personal anecdotes for week 2. Thanks very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.